This presentation is about the basics of relative clauses, and it should help you with exercises 1 and 2 in Chapter 11. The next presentation is also about relative clauses. It goes into some of the finer points, so that will apply to some of the other exercises. In this one, we're going to try to distinguish relative clauses from content clauses, and also talk about the structure of the relative clauses themselves. So the first problem is that sometimes they look somewhat similar to content clauses. On the surface, they aren't really. But this is a problem partly of the ambiguity of the word that in English and partly of other factors. So let's look first of all at content clauses so that we refresh our memories about what those are, and then you'll see that relative clauses are really different. Here are some examples of content clauses, and they're acting as complements to different kinds of things. In the first sentence here, he let us know that we're not going to let this affect our season. You could drop that and say, he let us know we're not going to let this affect our season. It doesn't matter. In either case, that clause there, with or without its subordinator, is the complement of the verb know. It's acting pretty much like a direct object, right? If there was a noun phrase right there instead, you could just swap out one for another. He let us know his name. He let us know the problem. He let us know we're not going to let this affect our season. That's the slot for the complement of the verb. The second one also shows a content clause being a complement, not to a verb, right? Are you seeing it? The content clause is in orange, that the tattoo status has not changed for old Americans. Are you seeing what that's a complement to? The complement to aware, which you know, you can tell is an adjective, right? Because it can be modified by very. You could say very aware. It has a comparative and a superlative form, more aware, most aware. All right? Another thing that a content clause can complement is a noun. Now you see that in the third sentence. The notion that there is both a struggle for and against tattoos taking place within American culture is one big noun phrase. The head of the noun phrase is notion. Its first dependent is a determiner, the notion, and the other dependent is this big content clause, which is its complement. And again in the last sentence, you see a content clause being a complement to notion, again to a noun, and again it's notion. What's out of control is the notion that all money is theirs. You see how that's one big noun phrase? The notion that all money is theirs is what's out of control. You can move it around. Now, let's contrast those to a relative clause. In this last sentence, when I found it in the corpus, it actually contained a relative clause and also this content clause. And I've taken out the relative clause to simplify things here, but now let's put it back in. Look at this complete sentence from the corpus. What's out of control is the notion that too many people in Washington hold that all money is theirs. Now, both of those are dependent clauses, and they both start with that. But there's a difference in the structure of these clauses. What's out of control is the notion that too many people in Washington hold that all money is theirs. You have two subordinate clauses there, right? Both of those are inside the noun phrase. The notion that too many people in Washington hold that all money is theirs is one big noun phrase, and again, you could move it. However, those two clauses are of different types. The one in green is the relative clause. And how do we know that? One of the big clues is that when we say all money is theirs, we have a complete clause. We have a subject, all money, and a verb, is, and a PC, theirs. Therefore, what is the word that doing to that clause? It doesn't have a function, right? It's not the subject or the verb complement. It's not a modifier or anything, right? You know this, right? It's the subordinator. So now compare that to the other clause. First of all, if we took out that from the relative clause, too many people in Washington hold, right away we notice that that clause isn't grammatical. Something's missing from it. We were able to take away that from the other one. It had no function, so the clause was still okay. But in this case, that does have a function. It's not a subordinator. In fact, if we put it at the end of the phrase, we see it in its natural place. Too many people in Washington hold that. So what is that doing there? Are you getting it? You can get the meaning, right? Too many people in Washington hold that notion is what it's trying to say. And it's standing in for that notion. That is standing in for that notion. It's standing in for a noun phrase, and so you've got it now, right? It's a pronoun. In fact, it's a relative pronoun. That's why it had to move to the front of the clause. It goes from too many people in Washington hold that to that too many people in Washington hold. It gets moved to the front of the clause, right? Because it's a relative pronoun. So in the relative clause, the word that has a function. It's not just sitting there subordinating the clause. So we can say that we can summarize the differences between relative clauses and complement clauses with reference to three things. First of all, the complement clauses you saw were a complement. The content clauses you saw were a complement to something. And if they're a complement to a verb or an adjective, it's pretty easy to say they're not relative clauses, right? Because relative clauses have to be in a noun phrase, not a verb phrase or an adjective phrase. But when it comes to something within a noun phrase, we can still distinguish because the content clause can be a complement, but the relative clause is just a modifier. You'll see examples of that in a minute. The other two differences have to do with the thing that gets relativized. Now, in the previous example, that was a relative pronoun. They're not always pronouns. Sometimes they're relativized other things. So that's why your textbook calls them are. And you'll see examples of that in a minute. Don't worry about that right now. If it's confusing, you can think of it as a relative pronoun and then just you'll know the exceptions. All right? Because it is a relativized thing, it has an antecedent. And that's outside of the relative clause. So in the example that we just saw, that was a pronoun and its antecedent was notion, which was in the matrix clause. And the relativized element also, as we just saw, it has a function in the clause. And there are lots of functions. It's not always the subject or the object, although those are the real common ones. But you'll see all the functions. We're going to go through each one of these characteristics in more detail. So first of all, let's see that a relative clause is just a modifier. We saw before the content clause that all money is theirs. That was the content clause, remember? And it was the complement to notion. We know it's the complement to notion because if we change out notion for a different noun, it may or may not license it. So the question that all money is theirs crashes. That's a bad sentence. Right? Question doesn't license content clauses, at least not declarative ones. It doesn't license declarative content clauses. Even though we can get the meaning of this, and we can get the meaning of this one too, the image that all money is theirs. We could figure out, if a second language speaker said that, I don't think we'd have too much trouble figuring out what they mean, but we don't say it that way. We say the image of all money being theirs. Right? And that's not a question of meaning. It's purely a question of form. Image will license a prepositional phrase, but it won't license a declarative content clause. Now, with relative clauses, we don't have that problem. The notion that too many people hold, that was the relative clause, right? Too many people hold that, or that too many people hold, that's the relative clause, right? Now, anything that licenses the verb hold will also license this relative clause. If you have any licensing problems here, it's not with the fact that it's a relative clause instead of a prepositional phrase or instead of an interrogative clause. As long as the actual words are licensed, the thing is licensed. So look at all the things that too many people can hold. Meetings that too many people hold, resources that too many people hold, puppies that too many people hold, ice cream that too many people hold. Anything you can hold, you can say the X that too many people hold. So it's just a modifier inside the now phrase. All right, but the other criteria will help you more. So let's see, first of all, the things that can be relativized. We've been looking at sentences where the relativized pronoun in all of those cases was that. But the relativized thing doesn't always have to be that. It can be other pronouns and it can be other things that aren't pronouns. A lot of times it's which. A movie has to do certain things which are essential to making it a drama. The relative pronoun is which. The antecedent is certain things. Sometimes it's who. Unlike athletes who use Twitter to publicize charity golf tournaments, the relative pronoun is who. Its antecedent is athletes. In other sentences, it's whom. I just didn't give you an example of that. That's functionally the same thing, it's just an object. Sometimes it's whose. This one's poetic, but they don't have to be poetic. This is a completely commonplace construction. The angels did commune with the good old man, whose loving heart prompted him to go about doing good. Now, we're getting to the cases here where the relativized item is not a pronoun. In this case, it is in fact a genitive pronoun. But you notice that it's acting here like genitive pronouns do, just like your, his, their. It's acting like a determiner in this relative clause. The old man's loving heart. Whose loving heart? So, whose is the relativized item here? And its antecedent is the good old man. Now, here's a case where it's clearly not a pronoun. The relativized thing is clearly not a pronoun. It's been clear to me that introverts live in a world where many of them are trying to pass as extroverts. We can't call where a pronoun in any sense of the word, but it is a relativized thing. And it does have an antecedent, as the antecedent, a world. And where is not the only one that's not a pronoun. When also works. I think why also works sometimes. There's a few of them. Okay. So what we've seen with this slide is that in the relative clauses, there is a relativized element that doesn't exist in the content clauses. And it's not always that. It can be a variety of words. But it's a limited set, right? Not more than, a dozen, 15 at the outside. All right. Now here's another trick that makes it a little bit hard to spot relative clauses when you're looking for them. A lot of times the relativized thing can be dropped. It's there covertly, but you don't actually pronounce it. Not all the time, but here are some examples of when it can be. Just find the thing you enjoy doing more than anything else. Do you see where you could insert a that or a which into this sentence? Look for that. Okay, the place where you put it in is right at the beginning of the relative clause, because that's where it would be if it were overt, right? Just find the thing that you enjoy doing more than anything else. Just find the thing which you enjoy doing more than anything else. The relative clause is still absolutely the same structure, even when you can omit the relativized element. All right. Here's another one. Support bacteria, they're the only culture that some people have, which some people have. Experience is something that you don't get until just after you need it, something which you don't get until just after you need it. Those are relative clauses too. When you're looking for them, consider, if you see a clause after a noun, consider whether you can insert that or which, and then analyze it and see if that or which would act as a subordinator or as a pronoun. Actually, if you can insert which, you know it's a pronoun because that is a subordinator, but which is never a subordinator. If you can insert which, then you have a relative clause, not a content clause. Okay, so now we've seen that relative clauses always have a relativized element, and we've seen that sometimes it's not out loud, it's just covert in the structure. And it has an antecedent all the time. And now let's look inside the relative clause and see what the function of the relativized element can be. It will always have one. It will always have a function in the clause, and that's something that's not true of the subordinator in a content clause. Now, a lot of times it's the subject. That's your first example. All those who believe in psychokinesis. Who believe in psychokinesis is a relative clause modifying those. The determiner is all, right? So you have a long noun phrase, all those who believe in psychokinesis. That whole thing is the subject of the matrix clause. The subject of raise is all those who believe in psychokinesis. It's that whole thing. But I want you to look inside the relative clause. It will also have, relative clauses also have normal sentence structure. They have a subject and a verb, and then they have optional complements and modifiers and what have you. So in this case, we have who believe in psychokinesis. Then we have subject, verb. In psychokinesis, that prepositional phrase is a complement. So subject, verb, complement here. Do you see how who is the subject of believe? Incidentally, when it's the subject is the time when you can't drop it. And except in some varieties of Appalachian English, we're talking about that on the discussion board a little bit, so I won't say more about it here. Those are the subject-contact relatives we talked about. Okay. In the second example, if you must choose between two evils, pick the one you've never tried before. Can you find the relative clause here? Tricky, right? The relativized element is covert. So see where you can insert that or which or who. Who can also be dropped. You got it? The one that you've never tried before. The one which you've never tried before. You've never tried before is the relative clause here with a covert relativized element. So what is that relativized element doing in this clause? We have that you have never tried before. What's the subject of have? The main verb is have, right? Or have. You can look at the whole verb. Have never tried. What's the subject of have never tried? Is you, right? So we know that that is not the subject because it already has a subject. If it wasn't a relative clause and we put it back to its default order, if it was a canonical clause, how would it sound? Can you hear it? You have never tried that before. You've never tried that evil before. That's what its natural place would be. Now you can tell what it's doing, right? It's the object of try. You've never tried that before. So sometimes they're a direct object of complement of a verb, that's to say. When they're the complement of a verb, they can be dropped. All right. Now it's getting more complicated. Check out this one. This paper presents the results of a study. Try splitting these up into two sentences like the ESL students do. This paper presents the results of a study. In that study, artists made line drawings intended to convey specific 3D shapes. If this were a class in English as a second language, I might give you those two sentences and say, combine those two sentences into one, and you'll end up with a relative clause. And this is the sentence you would end up with. So you have a study, and study is the head of this noun phrase, and the modifying relative clause is in which artists made line drawings intended to convey specific 3D shapes. So you see the verb, right? It's made. You see the subject, it's artists. And you see an object, line drawings intended to convey specific 3D shapes. What is that prepositional phrase doing? The results of a study, artists made line drawings intended to convey specific 3D shapes in that study. The prepositional phrase is an adjunct there. So what's the function of which? It's just the object of the preposition is all. Right? That's a pronoun, and it's acting. It's standing in for the antecedent is study, a study. And in that case, if you're asked for the function of the relativized element, like you will be in question 2, I think it is, you would say it's the object of the preposition. Right? It doesn't matter where the preposition... In this case, the whole prepositional phrase had to move to the front rather than just the relativized element, but that's not going to affect your analysis at all. So we've seen subject, object of verb, object of preposition. Now how about this one? The market is worried about Italy, whose debt has an average maturity of 7 years. We talked about whose, right? If we separated this sentence into 2 sentences, we'd get the market is worried about Italy. Italy's debt has an average maturity of 7 years. So, has is the verb, and is who's the subject? Yes and no. Not really. The subject is whose debt, right? Italy's debt has. So what is the function of whose specifically? Well, it's doing what subject determiners do, right? It's acting like a determiner to the word debt. So you can say, if you see whose, you can say that it's a determiner in the relative clause. And now, check out one that's not a pronoun. These are the times when you need to do what you enjoy most in life. Do you see the relative clause there? The relativized element is when. So let's split it up into 2 sentences again. These are the times you need to do what you enjoy most in life at those times. So, at those times gets replaced by the relativized element when, right? And its antecedent is the times. But what's the function? The function won't change. You need to do what you enjoy most in life at those times. Do you see the function of that? It's just an adjunct. Right? It could easily be dropped. So you saw that relativized elements can be subjects, objects of verb, objects of preposition. They can be determiners, and they can be adjuncts. All those functions are possible. Remember to look at the function of the relativized thing inside the relative clause. The question won't be asking you about the function of the relative clause inside the matrix clause or anything like that. Just the relativized thing inside the relative clause. All right. Now, lastly, let's look at some cases where, in fact, the form of a sentence, what it looks like on its shape, doesn't really tell us whether it's a content clause or a relative clause. The structure underneath will be different, and we know that because you can arrive at 2 different interpretations. And the way that we can explain why sentences that look exactly like each other actually have 2 different meanings is by saying that underneath their structure is different. So these are cases of ambiguity between content clauses and relative clauses. Okay? They won't happen when the relativized thing isn't that, because other relativized things aren't subordinators. A content clause should have a subordinator, right? And remember that the content clause's subordinator can also be covert. So if you can insert that into the sentence, you have ambiguity. If the word that is there, you may have ambiguity, If you can insert that into the sentence before the clause in question, then you may have ambiguity. If you can insert which, it's a relative clause and not a content clause. But if you can insert that, or if that is already there, and there are no other clues that distinguish, then you may have ambiguity. So here are some examples. There was evidence that he was hiding. Now, are you getting two meanings out of this? Okay, first of all, let's imagine that we looked for him, and we couldn't find him, and somebody suggested that he just didn't happen to be there, it wasn't intentional. But somebody else found a clue that suggested that it was intentional that he was avoiding us. That person found evidence that he was hiding. Now imagine a different situation where we knew for a fact that he, whoever he is, had some evidence and he was hiding that evidence. That's a different situation, right? But in both cases, you could say there was evidence that he was hiding. The intonation might be a little bit different, but the written form would be the same. So, what is the structure that we would argue for each one? First of all, let's take the relative clause. Let's split it up into two sentences again. There was evidence. He was hiding that evidence. Evidence existed, and he was hiding that evidence. Relative clause, right? So that, if it's a relative clause, should have a function. He was hiding that evidence. That evidence is the direct object, right? And similarly, evidence that he was hiding, that is the direct object. On the other hand, if he was just hiding, he wasn't hiding anything, he was just hiding in the corner, and we found evidence that suggested that he was hiding in the corner, then that has no function, right? It's a subordinator. He was hiding is the complete sentence. So we can explain how people get two different meanings out of that sentence by saying that in one case they interpret it as a relative clause where that is a pronoun. In the other case they interpret it as a content clause where that is a subordinator. Now, notice that if the word hiding were a word that required a direct object, this would no longer be ambiguous. For example, if we said there was evidence that he was looking for, that cannot possibly be a content clause, right? Because he was looking for is not a complete clause. So that can't be the subordinator. We need that in the structure of the sentence. He was looking for that evidence. In that case, we would have to say that the clause was relative. Right? But if it's possible to make the clause without a direct object, you can get ambiguity. Here's another example. The idea that they're protesting is ridiculous. And let's look at this one from the other perspective. Say that protesting is a verb that doesn't license direct objects at all. The idea that they're sleeping is ridiculous. What does that have to be? The idea that they're sleeping. It has to be a content clause, right? Because you can't sleep an idea. But you can protest an idea. So this could mean they were protesting an idea. That idea is ridiculous. Combined, the idea that they're protesting is ridiculous. On the other hand, protesting doesn't require a direct object. It's like if people are out in the street shouting and you say, what are they doing? I can say they're protesting. It sounds different in the spoken form, but in the written form it would be the same. The idea that they're protesting is ridiculous. Different meaning, right? Now it's not that they're protesting a ridiculous idea. It's just that they are protesting, and the very idea of them protesting is ridiculous. So when you're asked if a clause is ambiguous, try to read it both ways. Try to read that as a subordinator and see if the clause following it can be a complete clause. And then try to read it as a pronoun and see if that pronoun can have a function in the clause. If you get a meaning both times, if you get a possible sentence with a meaning, then call it ambiguous. If one of the sentences sounds grammatically wrong, then it has to be either one or the other.